The new developments today on the increasingly angry debate over the balance of power in Washington. Republican Senator Charles Grassley last night saying President Obama, through a rash of executive orders and recess appointments, is setting some very dangerous precedents.
President Obama's decision to bypass the constitutional advice and consent of the Senate is not an isolated incident by the President. It is merely the latest escalation in a pattern of contempt for elected representatives of the American people and the constitutional separation of power.
Senator Grassley, one of the longest-serving members in Congress and ranking member on the Judiciary Committee, did not stop there, warning his Democratic colleagues that there will one day be a Republican back in the White House, and that, he says, once the genie is out of the bottle, there's no putting it back in. Joining me now for a fair and balanced debate, Jay Sekulow, Chief Counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice, and Julian Epstein, Democratic campaign consultant and former legal counsel for the full House Judiciary Committee. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here.
Megan.
So he takes to the Senate floor to deliver these remarks and then produces a written version, which are entitled Unconstitutional Power Grabs, and is rather upset. Before we get to the issues that he cites, let me ask you if you agree with this, Julian. This is what he writes. The time has come for Congress on a bipartisan basis to say enough is enough. I would ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to think hard about the precedent being set for the next Republican president. And that's when he says once the genie's out of the bottle, you're not going to be able to get it back in. Is there a bipartisan reason for the Congress to be extra sensitive about executive branch power grabs?
Always. I think that Congress should always be checking the executive when it comes to power grabs. I think there's no question of it. I think the problem with Senator Grassley's indictment was it wasn't a very persuasive indictment. Presidents going back for decades now have done recess appointments. President Bush did over 170 recess appointments compared to Obama's about 32. The context of the recess appointment was when a minority in the Senate was insisting on changing a democratically passed law to their liking. So if there was anything that was anti-constitutional, anti-democratic, it was the position of the Senate Republicans. And in fact, many of the criticisms, the real criticisms on the unitary executive, the executive arrogating powers, came under the Bush administration. I could give you a dozen examples where you had constitutional scholars saying the Bush administration, whether it was the outing of Valerie Plame, whether it was the not using Congress for military tribunals,
that's not what's at stake here.
It was
that's
eavesdropping without warrants,
Julian.
a whole host of issues. Let me just finish the point. I mean, I think you can make, and constitutional scholars made an incredibly persuasive point that it was the Bush administration that went much, much, much further than the Obama administration.
Okay.
I just think the indictment is not strong.
Because I just want the viewers to know, Grassley is upset, yes, about the recess appointments, some of which we talked about in our A block with the NLRB, 3 guys appointed to the NLRB, but many other things he cites in here as Barack Obama grabbing power. He cites, for example, the "We Can't Wait" slogan, basically we can't wait for Congress, and he's saying, sorry, but that's how the Constitution's set up. You kind of have to wait for Congress on certain things. Go ahead, Jay.
Well, I think you've got 2 points here that have to be made, and that is we have a separation of powers doctrine in the Constitution for a reason, and that is that you don't have an executive that starts acting as if they're the monarch. And let me quickly say with regard to the recess appointments, sure, the Constitution allows recess appointments, but Julian, it was the Democrats under Harry Reid and then Senator Obama who set up this pro forma sessions in order to block President Bush from making recess appointments. And you know what happened? President Bush stopped making them when they went in for pro forma session. So that's number one. You can make recess appointments, that's in the Constitution, but they have to actually be in recess. And it was Barack Obama and Harry Reid that put that in play. With regard to the second point you make, Megan, which is the overriding issue, and that is we have separation of powers in this country so that we are not under a monarchy. That you cannot ignore the legislative process. And when the president said, which he did, if the Congress doesn't get it done, I'm going to get it done. Well, Mr. President, you taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago. Read the Constitution. You don't get to do that. That's not the way it works in our system,
Julian,
our republic.
That's what Grassley's saying. He cites, among other, he goes into history here, and he talks about it. This is a quote from his letter. Having had their rights violated by a king, our founding fathers intentionally put the power to make laws in the branch of government that is most directly accountable to the citizens. He talks about how what you need is consent of the governed, and when the president bypasses Congress, not just with recess appointments, but by doing end-arounds on labor, doing end-arounds on cap and trade, or, he cites a number of other examples, it sets up a dangerous violation of separation of powers.
There's no question about that, and everybody would agree with that, Megan. And you know what you saw in the Bush administration, for example, when the Bush administration tried to impose a system on military tribunals. Actually, I support military tribunals in the context of Al-Qaeda and war criminals. But when he tried to circumvent Congress, the Supreme Court slapped him down. So if President Obama or any other president overreaches the executive power, there is a system in place for Congress or others to file a suit in federal district court and for the courts to strike that down. I doubt any of the examples that either you or Jay or Stephen in your previous segment have talked about would stand any chance in court of being struck down. Secondly, to Jay's point about the pro forma session,
I absolutely disagree
I just want to respond to your point.
Quickly, Julian, because we're running out of time, and I want to give you a chance to make your point.
The point is, on the pro forma session, you're right on that, and I don't want to confuse your viewers by getting into too much detail. The issue here was that Congress actually had to go out of session for the new session of Congress to start, which is when the president made the recess appointment, which is fully constitutional.
Now we're really deep in the weeds.
This is a case
now we're really deep in the weeds.
Yeah,
I got to go. Literally, I have 30 seconds left. Jay, I'll give you the last word.
Now, the president needs to read the Constitution that he taught, and the reason Senator Grassley's upset is this is acting like a monarchy. And as I said, Megan, the president said it. If Congress doesn't do it, I'm going to do it. But that's not the way the Constitution works.
And quickly,
Thanks,
quickly before we go, Jay, is there any chance of a legal challenge to these moves by President Obama?
Well, you've seen that there's individual challenges being planned right now and filed by some of the business groups on the NLRB issue. And because those, by the way, those appointments weren't even put up until the middle of December. And a few weeks later, the president does this move. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So, yes, legal challenges are in the works and being planned. And we'll see what happens. I'm actually optimistic that they'll carry the day.
And that's the way the system's supposed to work.
All right, guys. Thank you both so much.
Always a pleasure. That's the way the system's supposed to work.
Always a pleasure seeing you both. Thank you.